Hello, everyone. My name is Connor O'Brien. I am welcoming you all to our final formal presentation on the impact of Project 2025 on various aspects of our lives. Tonight is on education. Let me introduce you to tonight's speakers. First person who is speaking tonight will be Dr. Van Aswegan. Rachel has taught in 3 different countries, and including the US. She has taught at 2 Title I schools. She has her doctorate in education and is well versed in all of this. So thank you for coming up from the swing state of Virginia. And we also have Marrlee Burgess speaking with us tonight, who is a higher education consultant for the last 30 years, working with Keelan Consultants in education. So I believe Dr. Van Aswegan, you're going to go first. Is that correct?
One moment, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is our background. And I've also worked as an accreditation evaluator and administrator for many colleges. So my background is pretty broad, and I'm really thankful to be a part of this conversation because higher education is my passion, and I'm really glad to be here tonight. Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Rachel van Aswegan, and I did complete my Ph.D. in 2023, focusing on education policy. So this is in my wheelhouse. I am very happy to be here. Also from the blue state of Virginia. I will just
yes
put that in there, that we are officially a blue state. We are not on the list of swing states this year, so I'm very proud to have maybe had a slight hand in that. I think we can get started. So for those of you who've attended these sessions for the past few weeks, we have heard a lot about how Project 2025 most broadly focuses on personnel and in increasing the number of right-wing extremists in the government. So in the education space, it's the same thing. Donald Trump said in his Agenda 47 that quote, personnel is policy. And at the end of the day, if we have pink-haired communists teaching our kids, we have a major problem. So this is the general aura that the Project 2025 is bringing to the education space. So we'll go through a lot more of the specifics, but just to put that in the broader context, it is still focused on that personnel and integrating their own people into across the board in the bureaucracy of education. And that really centers on closing the Department of Education. So in both Agenda 47 and in Project 2025, it is very explicit that there is a goal to close the Department of Education at the federal level. And there's a huge push as well on the other side. So they're really kind of talking out of both sides of their mouths with this, though, because they're also talking about creating new credentialing bodies at the federal level to be the gold standard for education and to, quote, certify teachers who embrace patriotic values, support our way of life, and understand that their job is not to indoctrinate children, but very simply to educate them. However, so that's the quote, right? But education is by its very nature political. And they, in Project 2025 and Agenda 47, take that into account when they talk about funding preferences and favorable treatment for states that enact content changes and a number of other changes that we'll get into throughout this presentation. When it comes to the content restrictions, there is a huge push in, again, both Agenda 47 and Project 2025. We really tried to go through and find all of the parallels that show that this isn't something that is existing and that they can shy away from, right? This is from Agenda 47's website and Project 2025. So talking about defunding schools that engage in inappropriate political indoctrination, ensconced in language that is also around getting rid of gender ideology and critical race theory in our schools and pushing out anyone who, quote, spreads those discrimination to prevent critical race theory from doing that. When it comes to the content, there is also a huge push to bring the Christian right into schools and to get rid of the quote Marxism being preached in our schools as it resembles an established new religion. So the Project 2025 wants to aggressively pursue potential violations of the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution, which basically they're trying to push for allowing people to pray in schools, and everyone's right to freedom to exercise their religion does not end when you walk into the classroom. But what we can see in states like Louisiana, that that can get very muddy very quickly when people are also pushing to post the 10 Commandments in every classroom and have that be a requirement on 11 by 14 paper. And they're very specific about what freedom to pray really means in the classroom at the state level. Across the country, there's also a push for love of country and a fight for patriotic education and pushing the America's, quote, founding principles of liberty and equality that have successfully guided the United States through the most difficult periods in its history, including the long struggle to abolish slavery. And so there is a push to prioritize patriotic education over what has been really established as the truth and accurate and complete history from multiple perspectives. Yeah, this real big push to bring the Christian right into classrooms across the country in very explicit ways. And one of those specific ways in particular is the banning of critical race theory content and support. So again, we see this language really explicit across both Agenda 47 and Project 2025, talking about getting back to teaching reading, writing, and math, called arithmetic. Thank you, Mr. Trump. And we will give our kids the high quality pro-American education that they deserve. So again, you can see that nationalism element coming through when they're talking about banning critical race theory and cutting federal funding for any school or program that pushes critical race theory, gender ideology, or other quote inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto our children. And again, talking about those massive funding preferences, specifically for school districts that cut the quote bloated number of school administrators, and in particular cutting diversity, equity, and inclusion bureaucracy. So removing any opportunity that schools and school districts and states would have to focus specifically on including diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of their foundational principles. Removing any federal funding for schools that want to have diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of their institutions. So when we think about critical race theory, before I get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what critical race theory actually is, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on what critical race theory is, because it's something we hear a lot about in the news. And so if you could in the chat just drop your definition of what you think that critical race theory is. So critical race theory, when we think about CRT in education, there are actually two forms of CRT. And so when we're talking about critical race theory, which is what gets discussed in the news, we're talking about generally speaking, what you guys were speaking about. So that intellectual and social movement that started in the legal field, but basically it has integrated itself into many different fields and holds that racism is institutional and structural in nature, and that there should be a goal of eliminating all forms of race-based and other unjust hierarchies. So when we're talking about critical race theory states that racism is inherent in institutions in the United States and creates and maintains inequalities that we as Americans should try to undo. However, there's another CRT within the field of education that I think is really important to point out to people, that I think gets mixed and muddled in this conversation, because when this happened, back in like 2016, when critical race theory really came under attack within education, in the education and education research spaces, there was another CRT that was being discussed and written about and studied, and that's culturally responsive teaching. And I think that the right in general, and Project 2025 in particular, has co-opted CRT as critical race theory to also undo all of the really good work that has been done to push for culturally responsive teaching in the classroom. So culturally responsive teaching refers to an approach of teaching and learning that facilitates the achievement of all students by recognizing that culture is a powerful force in learning and shaping how we see ourselves, shaping how we see the world around us. So culturally responsive classrooms and culturally responsive teachers are going to be reflective on that and integrate culturally supported learning opportunities for their students to enhance their strengths and build on what they already know and what they already experience in the cultural level, in their own culture. Students as sisters, as brothers, as racially identifying, as gender, in gender affirming ways, all of the different ways that you could interpret culture, that we can bring those into the classroom to help strengthen learning so students feel seen, heard, and understood, and then they can engage more safely in the learning process. So I think it's really interesting that both these abbreviations of CRT were occurring at the same time in the education spaces, and CRT as an acronym got co-opted to attack critical race theory while also attacking the infrastructure that would support culturally responsive teaching. So I just wanted to really highlight that for people because it's something I wish had ever been said on MSNBC or anywhere. And so now I can actually stand somewhere and say that. We'll have opportunities for questions about all of that in a few minutes, but we've got a little bit more about what's going on at the K through 12 level. So what happens if CRT is removed from the classrooms, right, is that both the understanding that racism is structural and inherent in all systems in the US, that would be left out of schools and left out of the bureaucracies and systems that, not the racism itself, but the understanding that the racism is there would be pushed out and not left unaddressed at the CRT critical race theory level. Also, that what would be left out is the recognition of students' cultural displays of learning and meaning making. And there's a nice quote here from Zaretta Hammond, who's a big leader in culturally responsive teaching, about moving to use more cultural knowledge as scaffolding for the learning of content. That reading, writing, and arithmetic is also culturally based, right? And we can integrate culture to support all of the information processing that students do in the classroom. And both that understanding of structural racism and understanding that culture supports learning would both be removed by the policies put forward by Project 2025 and Agenda 47. So that's one big piece, is the culture and CRT and content control that is going to be put into place if Project 2025 and Agenda 47 get to be in place in the next administration. And the second big goal of these policies would be to, quote, put parents back in charge and give them the final say. So looking at parents as the sort of customers for public education, and that school choice should be majorly supported by federal funding, and quote, create a feedback loop that does not exist in the more centralized top-down systems like the district schools. That said, America has one of the least centralized education systems in the world. So I question a little bit that language about centralization. And then they make a bunch of claims about how school choice leads to higher education rate or graduation rates, higher parental satisfaction and involvement, lower costs, and higher test scores, which are not necessarily supported by the data. So Agenda 47 may not have all of their ducks in a row when it comes to data, at least in terms of being explicit that the data on school choice is really muddy in terms of student achievement and all of the other things I mentioned. They also talk about putting in place a Parents' Bill of Rights to include curriculum transparency and forms of universal school choice. And districts would need to have both curriculum transparency and universal school choice to receive federal funding for education. They also talk about implementing direct election of school principals by parents, which that's heavy. I don't know what that would look like, but it's in there. And that's in Agenda 47, not only in Project 2025. And they also talk about the portability of existing federal funds and taking immediate steps to reduce and rescind new requirements and federal restrictions on charter schools. So when we're talking about school choice, a lot of what that means is integrating charter schools into public school. It also talks about providing vouchers to go to private schools. So in the voucher system, you're taking money from the public school system and putting it into private schools. And then in the other system, charter schools are still public, but they're also talking about removing all requirements and any regulations and restrictions on charter schools. So anything that's deregulated in education spaces don't usually end well for the students attending the schools. I think we've got a lot more about school choice. So before moving on to what the data says about choice, isn't choice a good thing? So what does parent choice mean to you guys when you're thinking about school choice in the context of public education? And Connor already mentioned electing school principals based on ideology rather than competence. So that's one piece that choice would allow parents to do, is make decisions based on ideology. Choosing educational excellence, public funding for religious schools, choosing to live where you live based on the ratings of the school districts. So that's our major source of choice at the moment, when and especially in Rochester, that's a big part. Okay, control of books, choosing the best environment for children with disabilities, being able to homeschool, objecting to content. Thank you for all of those insights. You can keep them coming if you would like to. So when we're talking about school choice, in terms of Project 2025 and Agenda 47, what they are talking about is voucher programs and charter schools. But voucher programs account for more than 70% of school choice option. Like when a district moves to a choice system, most of their attention and focus is going to voucher programs, which, to some of your points, moves public dollars to private institutions and crucially away from the public institutions, right? So if you're giving your money to the religious school down the road through a voucher, the public school is not getting those dollars. And ultimately what the data shows on choice in districts and states that have integrated choice programs is that any achievement improvements are too small to justify the calls for school choice when other programs and solutions have similar or larger achievement gains from other reforms than you're getting from school choice. And you're doing that within the traditional public school system. So those could be things like changing class size or adopting new strategies for curriculum and instruction, which could touch on the curriculum transparency piece, might be some way to help with that. But ultimately what this project and agenda are pushing for is this school choice that doesn't come with the gains that would justify this as the main option, which then just leaves you with what other people were saying about the ideology piece, right? Like you're pushing for ideology over content and learning and achievement and efficacy instead of other reforms that actually achieve progress. We also talk about in the charter school systems that charter schools are possible to push and fuel innovation within education, but most choice schools feature curriculum and instructional practices that reflect back traditional public school systems. However, innovation is just as likely in the traditional public school education, public schools as it is in charter schools. So schools that have adopted distinctive missions are not novel to charter schools. We can do that in part in the general traditional public schools as well. Also, choice programs that lack regulation take money from public schools, as I mentioned before. And that availability allows private schools to simply raise their tuition however much that voucher is, and then they're just taking that money. And the state is subsidizing private education along any number of different ideological lines. So, and they're explicitly pushing, politicians are explicitly pushing to allow public money to go to religious institutions as well in Project 2025 and Agenda 47. There are two more things from my end before we move on to the higher ed side of things, just to kind of give you context for time. I wanted to draw attention to the school safety pieces of Agenda 47 and Project 2025, because I know for many people, and in my experience in schools, school safety is a huge issue for many along a lot of different dimensions. So when we think about school safety, the first thing that comes to mind for me as a teacher is school discipline. I know for many of you guys, it's going to be about guns, right? And guns in schools. And so if we look at point number 2 and 3 on the slide, there is a push to, in Agenda 47 in this case, allow quote, highly trained teachers to carry concealed weapons in classrooms as a solution for gun violence in schools. And there's also a push to harden our schools against forms of outside intruders, like in this case, hiring veterans, retired police officers, and other trained gun owners, inviting and hiring them into the schools to protect children. Other things that would be included in that are things like metal detectors and bag searches and clear bag policies. All of those would go along with that, like, hardening of schools, which is all pushed for in Agenda 47. The other thing that I just wanted to draw attention to, because it hurt me to hear anyone, and in particular someone in leadership in our country, to speak about my students this way, was that they wanted to push for an overhaul of federal standards on school discipline to get, quote, out of control troublemakers out of the classroom and into reform schools and correctional facilities, to get violent thugs out of our children's classrooms. When troubled youth are out of control, the consequences must be swift, certain, and strong. And I wanted to put this quote in here firstly because he's explicitly calling our children thugs, and I am not okay with that. But also to point out that he's talking about, at the same time, removing the Department of Education entirely from the government, and also putting in place federal standards on school discipline that would be coming from where now, right? That's sort of a question that I have for them about where would these policies and standards even be coming from if there is no Department of Education. So just again, pointing out that messiness and this not perhaps thought through element of what federal education policy is and what it looks like. Yeah, just to kind of point that out as well within their policies, that they're not always humanizing. They're humanizing some of our children, but not all of them. And also not pointing to where policies would be coming from that they're discussing as so important. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on is Title I funding for poor schools. So when we talk about federal money coming to schools at the state level, much of that money comes in the form of Title I funding, which goes to the poorest schools in the country. It's the largest proportion of federal taxpayer spending under education law. It goes to schools in lower income areas. What they're talking about doing is moving Title I funds to the Department of Health and Human Services. So in their mind, Health and Human Services deals with low-income areas, low-income families, low-income people. So they're more equipped, that's in quotes, more equipped to address the needs of these populations if we give Title I funds for education as a no strings attached formula block grant. But if we think back to school choice, when things are not regulated and restricted in education spaces, outcomes do not match the goals. In the longer term, restoring revenue responsibility for Title I funding to the states over a 10-year period, so eventually phasing out federal spending in Title I schools altogether, eliminating impact aid not tied to students. So with this one, this is funding for schools that have a lot of federal lands in them and non-taxed land in their areas. So things like military bases and tribal lands. Anything that's not tied specifically to a student would be eliminated from the federal budget. And some of you were talking about parental choice involving students with special needs. That is one thing that would stay, is to allow children with special needs who fall under Title I to pay for private learning options, including tutoring services and curricular services. Everything else that is managed by the Department of Education currently would be reduced by 10%, which would cut 29 programs throughout the federal government. So I don't have a list, unfortunately, of those 29 programs and what those would be. But at this point, I want to pause for a second and just address any questions that you have, concerns, comments, and then we will move on to higher ed. Sorry, Marrlee, I did not leave you very much time.
That's okay. I'm going to stop the share just so that we can look at each other and talk to each other if you want to do that.
There's a number of great comments in the chat and discussion. I don't know if anybody wants to raise one of their comments aloud and we can talk for a minute about it. Vicky talked about a specific line from Agenda 47. Republicans will ensure children are taught fundamentals like reading, history, science, and math, not left-wing propaganda, and makes the comment, I don't think they really thought through the history idea.
Mhm.
Well, I'm sure they have an idea of what history they meant, but I think it was just sort of like fundamentals, reading, writing, history, social studies, but if you're really even remotely teaching history, you're getting into some of the things that they find the scariest, most dangerous, most Marxist.
Well, so they're pretty explicit about what expectations they would have for history curricula in terms of content, and that is a Christian nationalist history of the country. So and they're pretty explicit about what they believe the history that should be taught is. So it's just perhaps incomplete, and definitely incomplete. I think I can say that with pretty confidently in this group. Yeah.
Whitewashed. Yeah.
Marrlee, do you want to jump in?
I think I will. Okay. So, Rachel and I met 2 or 3 times before we had our discussion tonight. And, I was thinking, and we discussed how much aligned the themes are in both sections of the K through 12 presentation and the higher ed section. But the more I heard Rachel talk and discuss all these points and thinking about some of the issues that exist in the higher ed portion of this, it's really very, very apparent. They're taking a very similar approach to higher education as they are to K through 12. A lot of themes, and those are going to be coming very obvious as I work through my slides. But I just kind of want to say that as an umbrella to this presentation. Some of it's going to sound very familiar. What I've chosen to do with this section is to focus specifically on accreditation. The chapter on education is very long. The section on higher education reform is very hefty as well. There's a lot of stuff in there, but when I kept reading through it again and again, it became very apparent to me that by focusing on accreditation, that's going to address some of their agenda in a very systematic way, in a way which it's possible many people in the general public don't know what accreditation is and what it involves. So it could very easily be kind of like a under the rug kind of an approach. So I wanted to kind of just pull that out and kind of bring it to your attention. So before I do that, though, I'd like to provide a little bit of context about accreditation, just so that we are starting on the same foundation. So thinking about accreditation in higher education, what is it and why is it important? The first bullet describes to you a general kind of characteristics of what accreditation looks like. I'm referring now specifically to institutions of higher education. Accreditation is a process that is highly participatory throughout a college community as they work to evaluate how they are meeting the standards that are articulated through their particular accrediting body. The one really important thing to note in this particular paragraph, this first one, is that at this point, institutions can voluntarily enter into accreditation bodies. So they can align themselves with associations where they feel are most appropriate for their institution. The institutions in this area generally associate themselves with the Middle States Commission, for example. Middle States traditionally covers kind of the northeastern seaboard and then into Ohio section. But again, that also is changing as colleges are being given flexibility to choose where they want to align. But again, I will state it's a voluntary association. So the standards that are developed within each commission are essentially vetted and voted on by its member institutions. So one of the big reasons why this is important is in order for students to receive federal student aid and for institutions to get federal funding, they must be nationally recognized by an accrediting body. So that's one of the big reasons why an institution would want to be accredited. And then simply put, accreditation ensures that colleges and universities meet acceptable levels of quality. So, the federal government wants to ensure that the funds are going somewhere where there is quality assurance in some degree. And then we're going to talk about, how does that happen in the next slide. So before I go into accrediting bodies, just starting with where did this start? The Higher Education Act of 1965 is essentially the place where it started. It was a federal law that was established to provide financial aid and support to students of higher education and institutions of higher education. Its aim was to strengthen the educational resources of our colleges and universities and to provide better access to students across the United States, regardless of zip code or socioeconomic category. The Higher Education Act is reviewed and reauthorized by Congress every 5 years or so. So the three main elements of oversight that govern the HEA's federal state programs include eligibility requirements for accreditation for colleges and universities. They oversee the accrediting agencies by the Department of Education. And they also oversee the compliance monitoring of individual institutions to ensure that the federal funds are being properly administered. So every time you have a reaccreditation process, there's a whole list of basically a checklist for compliance monitoring, and that's folded into the reaccreditation process. When the peer evaluators make their site visit, they want to ensure that all those things are being done. So for example, one big one is ensuring that policies are easy to find and transparent. That seems like an obvious thing, but a lot of places don't make it very easy for their students. But so that's an example of what HEA oversees. And then in 1992, during one of those iterations or reauthorizations of the HEA, they established the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity. And so this group is actually a bipartisan advisory body that evaluates the evaluators or evaluates the accreditors. So they work with the U.S. Department of Education and the Secretary of Education on all matters related to higher education accreditation. Again, they oversee the accrediting bodies, but they do not grant accreditation. So when we think about the role of government in accreditation, this is where we get at some of those points about the Department of Education. What is it doing? And we'll talk about what Project 2025 says in terms of what they shouldn't be doing. The U.S. Department of Education oversees, as I stated earlier, accrediting bodies, but it does not grant institutional accreditation. There are right now 63 U.S. Department of Education approved accrediting bodies, which include institutional accrediting bodies. and programmatic accrediting bodies. The institutional accrediting bodies are the ones that cover whole colleges and universities of all kinds. So faith-based, single discipline schools like art schools. Programmatic accrediting bodies cover things like schools of pharmacy, schools of law, schools of nursing, and other disciplines like that. And then finally, state agencies do play a role, but it's pretty much a regulatory role just to ensure that colleges and universities are meeting the standards set by the state. Again, but they do not accredit institutions. So now that we're on the same page with what accrediting is, what does Project 2025 and Agenda 47 say? So these are statements that are, again, the ones that kind of stuck out at me when I was reading through things that I think are worthy of discussion. Republicans will fire the radical left accreditors. Where have we heard that before? But yes, evidently we are all radical left people. They will prohibit accrediting agencies from leveraging their Title IV gatekeeper role, which is Title IV funding, to mandate that educational institutions adopt diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So they want to prohibit that. So the one thing that I want to point out, which I'm sure you all have already figured out, the HEA was established in part to ensure access to American citizens to higher education, as I said, regardless of income, zip code, and the accrediting standards of the major regional associations actually speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion to ensure that institutions support access to services and to the success of all students. It's all consistent with the HEA. However, as you know, DEI, the concept, has been recast as a political ideology and tagged as woke, or tagged as indoctrination by conservatives. So that's kind of where we're going with statements like number 2 and then statements number 3. Again, they say accreditors have been abusing their quasi-regulatory power to impose non-educational requirements, ideological preferences on colleges. So again, they have a problem with the ideology, their perception that, we're grabbing hold of all these students and making them left. And then finally, the last bullet, they want to revamp the system for recognizing accrediting agencies for Title IV purposes by removing the U.S. Department's monopoly on recognition. So this is back to the last bullet here, refers to the conservative stance about states' rights. They want to take accreditation away as well as oversight by the federal government. They believe that states should oversee their own schools and be allowed to do what they want. So it's their intent to change the landscape of higher education by essentially changing accreditation or getting rid of it. So with that said, what I wanted to do was kind of bring this down to a real life example. We're going to turn to my favorite example, which is the state of Florida, which has essentially become an incubator for Project 2025. You've probably been reading things almost every day about the state of Florida. I certainly have. And in my line of work in higher education, it's part of my job to stay abreast of trends essentially in higher education. And also, where are things going so that we can advise colleges and universities on, the future. You have to think about this, you have to think about that. Look what's happening there. Is this something that you want to worry about or think about as you develop your strategic plan, for example? The state of Florida has gotten into, and I will say, pretty big trouble with their accrediting body, to the point where they've been issued warnings about actions the governor has taken that essentially violate adherence to standards that speak directly to academic freedom and institutional autonomy. In the higher ed world, that's a pretty big deal. And I will say, this is just part of it. They're doing a whole lot of other stuff I'm not even go into right now. I'll touch on it. But these are the things right now which are at the forefront of the lawsuits and the discussions they're having down there. And I went through the Southern Association's list of standards just so you I could get a sense about which standards are they referring to, because each commission has a different set of standards. And these are the ones that I pulled out, given the issues that I read about. So the standard 1 of integrity, and there's some verbiage here about part of the standard and how it reads, honestly and openly with their constituencies and with one another. It's a pretty, not a big ask in my point of view, but they are violating that standard. Governing board. Integral to strong governance is the absence of undue influence from external sources. Again, that's a duh, but they're doing it. Standard 6 faculty. I'm sorry, I'm not being very eloquent by saying duh, but I'm just telling you what I'm feeling. Standard 6 faculty, fostering the intellectual freedom of faculty to search, to teach, to research, and to publish. Those are essential to the role of faculty. Academic freedom is something that's held very dearly, very closely in the higher education environment. There are such things as shared governance, which I won't get into, where, it's not only faculty, but they work with the college and ensuring that the mission of the college is being met through the work of the faculty and of the academic curriculum that is being delivered. And then finally, standard 11, educational policies, procedures. Part of the verbiage says it places primary responsibility for the content, essentially, of the curriculum with its faculty. So these are some of the standards that are up for discussion right now, given some of the actions that are being taken in Florida. And these are some examples. So in 2021, for example, the University of Florida barred 3 of its professors from testifying against the state in a lawsuit opposing restrictions on voting rights. In response, the Southern Association launched an investigation to determine if that decision was a result of undue political influence. It was. In 2023, the governor replaced, this is the most outrageous example, the governor replaced most of the board of trustees at New College of Florida with Republican allies and insiders. The newly installed board then fired the president and replaced her with the former Florida Republican State Speaker of the House. And New College has become, again, I use the word incubator, but it's become an incubator. They're trying to develop this model of a conservative college that the Heritage Foundation can embrace as, look, this is the way things should be. So that's what they're doing at the New College of Florida. So DeSantis isn't happy because the accrediting bodies are pushing back, and there's more, but he's crusading in what he calls the accreditation cartel. And the state of Florida has sued the U.S. Department of Education for giving private agencies unchecked power to determine educational standards at colleges. Thankfully, this time around, the federal court dismissed that lawsuit for failing to state a claim. But the lawsuits continue. And aside, Florida's still trying to find a new accreditor for its public colleges and universities. As an aside, I sat in on the U.S. Department of Education hearings when they were interviewing, as part of their regular process, some of the accrediting bodies, because they have to reaccredit the accreditors, right? And this whole topic of Florida came up, and it became very apparent that Florida was calling different commissions around the United States, asking for an interview, because they're basically, my point of view, and I think this is true, they're trying to find a place that won't require DEI, where they will let faculty be driven out by administrators who want to plan the curriculum, things like that. They're just really upset that they can't just do what they want. So that's Florida and what's happening in Florida in terms of actions, but there's more. So not only have there been actions, but there's been legislation. So while DeSantis and all of his political friends are trying to influence education, they're also trying to do it with law. And so you've probably heard about the Stop Woke Act, which was passed in 2022. This is legislation meant to reform education. But since its passage, luckily, part of the Woke Act was deemed unlawful. Just this past summer, as a matter of fact, the Chief U.S. District Judge, Mark Walker, issued a 2-page order granting a permanent injunction against the law's workplace training provisions, saying that the law violates free speech and also the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So they have basically struck down a piece of the Stop Woke Act when it applies to training in corporate settings. And then in addition to the Stop Woke Act, Florida has just become such an overachiever. If you look at PEN America, which is an organization that tracks censorship legislation throughout the United States, they have an Excel sheet, and you can go down and look at all the states and what's happening in the states. Florida, although they haven't surpassed, I don't think, Texas, I think it was Texas that's introduced more than 10 bills, but they have completely bypassed everybody in terms of their success at passing bills. So they have passed 5 bills, more than any other state legislature in the United States, targeting DEI and LGBTQ initiatives in K through 12 and higher education. So this is an example of what's going on currently in Florida and what they're trying to do. They want to influence their approach to education and what's going on in the schools, and also what's going on in society by passing these laws. So a result of these laws, Florida International University Board of Trustees, they voted to drop 22 courses from the core curriculum, including, and I don't have to read all this, but obviously they refer to studies that involve gender, sociology of gender, things that help you understand race, ethnicity. All those courses. If you think about critical race theory and some of the subject areas that are being targeted by the conservatives, they don't want any of these courses in their curriculum, in the core curriculum. And because they passed a law, SB 266, they could do this, and it's at a public school, a public university. So they can just go ahead and do this. Again, this would have been the purview of the faculty. Book bans. Florida has more books challenged for removal than any other state in the United States as of last year. Again, they're overachievers. And then another area, which it just hurts my heart, since 2023, 12 Florida state colleges and universities have eliminated DEI-related roles, divisions, and offices, which include intercultural, interfaith, LGBTQ, women's centers. These are all areas that were originally established at these colleges to provide critical services to support and promote access and success for student populations that need it, essentially. And these areas now have been basically eliminated. Some colleges have tried to recast them with different titles, but kind of hard to do that if they pull the budgets away, which is what they've been doing. It's ironic that they're doing this too, because Florida, as you know, has got a very extremely diverse population base. So they're hurting their own residents. And then just pulling out from Florida, just so you can kind of see what's going on currently, the Chronicle of Higher Education is tracking anti-DEI legislation throughout the United States. These are the states so far that have been able to implement anti-DEI legislation. Texas is doing some really horrible things, kind of along the same lines of Florida. But it's essentially, again, just they're mounting political pressure to end, as they call it, identity conscious recruitment and retention. So this is happening now. It's not like we're thinking about it. This is actually going on now. So if you look at just the end game, this is kind of where they want to end up, right? They want to eliminate quality insurance or change that process to water it down. They want to reduce or eliminate protections, support and access to education for students in vulnerable categories. They want to provide students with no protection from predatory for-profit institutions. During the DeVos time frame, during the Trump presidency, the for-profits, they were having a really good time. They were getting away with a lot of stuff. Luckily, when Biden came in, they basically shut down the Accrediting Association for the for-profit institutions because they weren't doing their jobs and students were getting bilked. And lucky he's been able to cancel loans from students who were basically sold a bill of goods. In other words, being recruited for a college that promised outcomes they weren't going to get. Finally, elimination of the U.S. Department of Education and accountability through accreditation would open the door for ideology to drive curriculum through political interference. Again, it mirrors what they're trying to do in the K through 12 area, and it's being exemplified in the state of Florida. So my only, I guess, if you want to call it positive, final thought is the current guardrails are in place. The system is in place. And by the way, I want to say, this is to say totally that higher education needs improvement. There's a lot of conversation about it. There's a lot of people working on it. They need improvement. I firmly believe that they need to streamline the ways they are approaching improvement processes. With that said, I truly believe, as someone who's worked as an evaluator, that it's a very robust process, the accreditation process. And if anything, someone has to be there to ensure that students are getting the education that they've been promised. And to me, that's the bottom line in this. And what this is it's shifting the focus from ensuring for excellence to making sure students are only learning from a very narrow curriculum, ideals and things that a political party thinks are more important. And so that's where we're at right now. But the guardrails are still in place. And as I outlined, the HEA, Department of Education, there's a lot of stuff you have to unwind in order to get anywhere with this stuff. But as you can see at the state level, it's happening. So let Florida be a cautionary tale. It's possible. But the lawsuits continue. They'll continue to challenge them. But getting rid of the federal oversight is not the approach to take for improvement. They want to reform, that they don't want to improve. So anyways, that's what I got for you. And I've got some references here if anyone wants to look up these resources. Any questions? Or we've kind of run out of time, but I do want to ensure that we have time for discussion.
Marrlee, that was terrifying, but wonderful, very thorough. And Rachel, that was really sobering. I'm shocked to see how far spread this is into Massachusetts and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Florida is exactly the test case, I guess. Any other questions we want to open it up to? Anybody?
That's 31 states with colleges affected by anti-DEI legislation. 31. That's more than half. That's horrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're finding its way into pockets of states. And the reality is, and you probably noticed, good portion, if not the majority, are red states. And essentially, I don't know what the backroom conversations are, or how they've been organizing themselves, but I have to believe that governors from red states have been part of this effort, and if they've got a control over the state Senate and House, that's where you're going to make some inroads.
They have the federal state and House, or Senate and House. It's going to be even worse.
That's the terrifying part.
Yeah. And, the other thing is we keep talking about how lawsuits will prevent this, not if Trump appoints more federal judges.
No, right. He's trying to put all those blocks right in a row so that he can get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to be sure to share this with people in other states, because I think a fair number of us know teachers and know people in education at every level. And I really am going to urge you guys to send this PowerPoint out to everyone who's involved in education, because this is horrible. You guys have done really amazing research. So thank you.
No, you're very welcome. I was actually really pleased, and I learned a lot from my research for sure. And I certainly I learned a ton from Rachel, because I really don't have my head in the K through 12 area, but it just really helped to hear that perspective, because it touches lives throughout a child's education. It's not just at this level; it's all the way across. And the terrifying part for me is the dogma and some of the things that they're trying to instill early on, and continue that thread throughout higher education. It's terrifying, and it's also strategic.
Yeah, that's the most terrifying.
I wanted to address one of the comments in the chat that was happening a little bit earlier about school safety and discipline reforms, and just one of the impacts, to your point, Marrlee, about how this can brutally impact students throughout their whole lives, is the push for police officers in schools. Not only is that putting more guns in schools, but it also, the data has shown that it increases the severity and frequency of disciplinary action against students, and increasing arrests of younger students. So it's adding fuel to the fire of the school to prison pipeline that upsets Nolan very much, of course, and also, as it should, and fuels the prison industrial complex. So these things are not they don't exist in a vacuum, and racism is inherent in that system as well. Those arrests and severity and frequency of disciplinary actions are not, there is disparity along racial lines for that.
Yeah.
And I know it's very upsetting. It's very upsetting.
Yeah. I'm right there with you, Nolan. That is, if you've all seen the documentary 13, that is how we continue to have slavery, because people who are incarcerated can be forced to work. And so by creating this school to prison pipeline against Black and brown people, it just reinstitutes it in another way. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and then I'll stop talking. They are doing all of these things very incrementally and strategically, and they learned a lot from the way the civil rights movement worked, to use the courts and to change things in steps. And now they're better at it than a lot of the progressives. And we have got to step up our game in so many ways, because this is not going away. Anything further on that happy note?
Just go get them.
Yeah.
So what can we do? What can we do?
So vote early, because that means they can check you off and they don't have to call you or worry about whether or not you're going to make it to the polls. Take 5 people with you, and to see if you can make a plan to do it over Zoom with people who live in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan or any of the states.
I was going to say, I got to tell you, this is a good story. I'm working with a college right now in Pennsylvania whose students, their registration to vote were turned away because their board of elections said that they had to prove that they weren't registered in their state, and the students they weren't told that, and they didn't have the proof with them. And so, as it turns out, it was false information. But this college is fighting back. As we talked about earlier, there's always somebody that they try to advocate for voting for students, and this person fought back, and it's being addressed now at the county board elections for this college. But this is an example of how they could easily be doing this in different counties throughout these swing states, really. But this is being addressed in this particular county. Thankfully, one of the good things the media did is they put a story out there, and they said this was happening. So
Because if it's
Um,
happening there, it's going to happen somewhere else,
right.
and they need to know that it can be fought.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. That's really good. One of the other things I saw today is Mitch McConnell finally acknowledged that Trump is unfit. Yeah, Vicky, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I just wanted to kind of underscore what we're talking about fighting back, and that is, how did the radical right get in this position of power? It's because they played a long game and they got really well organized.
Mhm.
We
Yeah.
can do that too.
We
Yeah.
taught him how,
Mhm.
you know, the civil rights movement,
Right.
a lot of the stuff that was happening in the
Yeah.
40s, 50s, and 60s. You know, they looked at our playbook and they're doing the same thing back this way. So
Right.
the same tactics can be used.
There was
Yeah.
one other thing that we were talking about. What else can we do? I don't think I heard this mentioned, but the Monroe County Democratic Committee needs help. They're kind of overwhelmed right now, and so if we can step up and volunteer and help them with various things in the office even, and also with all the phone banking, canvassing type stuff.
And driving people to polls on election day. If
All
we
of
all
those.
vote early, you're off the
Yeah.
hook on election day and you can do
Yep.
other things. So there's stuff to be done.